Thank you very much, BTL, for inviting me to speak at this event. It's wonderful to look out and see all these people who are expecting something from me, you know. And I'll try and deliver. But what I want to try and do today is not so much... Where's the clicker gone? Technology, eh? Or is it human error? One or the other. Thank you, Andy. The interesting thing about this is that I don't think I can teach you anything about assessment that you don't already know. But what I can do today is to try and get you to think critically about what we do as professionals, and to try and challenge some of the things we do, and to try and perhaps track some of the trends and see where they're going in terms of the history of things. So, we'll start with this. I don't know if you can read that. And then there's this, which is interesting, isn't it? Have you seen these kids with their iPads? The interesting thing about this is I dispute this. I don't think that children start appearing on the internet at 6 months. I think they're appearing a lot before then. So I get ultrasonic images from people saying, oh, we're expecting a baby in 3 months' time or whatever. I think children are immersed in technology before they're even born. And when they emerge into this world, within a short period of time, they're using things like that and using things like this. Maybe not an S8, but certainly they're using devices and technologies which are touch sensitive, which allow them to drill down deeper and explore the world around them. By the time they come to school, they're expecting these kind of things. And here's a shocking fact for you. The children coming into our universities now, the young people coming into our universities, have no memory at all of the last century, which, by the way, is the century that you were born in and educated in, and the century that influenced you the most. And the biggest problem we've got, I think, in education today is that the lecturers and the teachers that we have in our schools, in our colleges, in our universities, have the same problem as that. They teach and they assess in the same way that they were taught and assessed themselves. And the children and the young people that they are teaching and assessing cannot see the connections. A lot of what they're doing is irrelevant. And I'm speaking from experience here, from 40 years in the business as a teacher and an educator, and also as a technologist, looking at how the disconnects happen. So let's try and explore this. Let's try and unpack this, shall we? The first big question is why assessment? And I'm sure you could all shout out ideas about why we assess. But I'd like to just explore 5 reasons and then try and unpack this for you. The first of these oh, hang on, before we do that, let me show you this. Because this is the context of where we're coming from. So this is what would happen in 1 minute if you switched off the internet. All right, these are the latest stats, probably about a year old now, but they're reasonably accurate. The latest stats from various social media companies showing what happens in 1 minute on the internet. So over here, for instance, 3.5 million text messages being sent in the US alone. Up here, Amazon, I wish I was Jeff Bezos, don't you? So over $200,000 income every minute on Amazon. And we all use it these days, let's face it, most of us use it. Up the top there, YouTube, 400 hours of new video every minute being uploaded onto YouTube. Most of it's rubbish, but occasionally there's a gem in there, you know, which teachers and lecturers can use. I've used it myself sometimes. Here's a good one for you. Tinder, nearly 1 million swipes. It doesn't say whether they're left or right, but, you know, at least you're getting the picture about what people are using the internet for. They're using technology all the time. We are using technology all the time. Hands up if you've got a smartphone on you. Put your hands up if you've got... All right, put your hands up if you've got 2. You see, there's always a few. More than 2? There's always a few that have got 2. I won't ask you what you use the second one for, but you know, you can see people are immersed in technology, and so it's driving us. Andy was saying earlier on, it drives what we do, and to a certain extent he's right. But I can challenge that in another way later on, which I hope to come back to. Here's the content. Here's the questions I want to ask you. The first question is, why do we assess? Well, you would probably say, well, it determines student progress. It's a no-brainer, isn't it? That's the first one. Second one, it offers observable evidence of learning. That's debatable, actually, because it depends. I mean, testing isn't the full history of assessment. Assessment can be done without testing. And if you want to challenge me on that, come and speak to me afterwards. I wish we had time to go through these in more detail. It demonstrates understanding of the curriculum. Now, here's the two that often teachers don't ignore necessarily, but they're not fully aware of. The first one is this one here. It supports learning. Have you thought about that one? I'm sure you have. Good assessment should support learning. It should show students where they need to go next. It's what we call feed forward. And the final one here, it depicts our concept of education. What do we mean by education? What do we mean by learning? Well, the way we assess actually depicts that. It gives away what we think about it, what our philosophy is on it. And I think that's quite revealing depending on how you assess. And I'll let you think about that for a second. So we'll move on a bit, and we'll talk about some other things. So John Hattie, who's a New Zealand educator, now a researcher in Australia, he says this: there are two key elements to successful learning, and one of them is about positive feedback. So it's half of our success depends on assessment. If we get it wrong, why are we there? You know, learning will fail. If we get it right, the students will fly. And active learning is the other one, of course. And if we can meld those two together, then we're really on a winner. Marcia McLuhan says, we shape our tools, and now tools shape us, but then we shape them again. And we keep shaping those tools as they shape us. It's a symbiotic relationship we have. So technology is really important today. As Andy's shown you already, technology and assessment can combine really, really dramatically. Let me say that from my own research, I think there are three major trends you've got to look out for in the next 5 years. Well, I don't think we can predict any more accurately than about 3 years, but in the next 5 years, I think there are three major trends we need to look out for. The first one is that learning is going to be richly social. In other words, there's going to be a lot more collaboration and cooperation going on. Not the same thing, but both of those things I think need to happen more. And I think we're going to see a lot of assessment methods being challenged on the basis that we want to see more collaborative learning taking place. We want to see how students will operate in a team, for instance, how they will make decisions based in a team, how they will collaborate, how they will negotiate meaning together, how they will give and take in terms of their skill sets and so on. So the first one is going to be a social type of assessment that we need to see happening soon. And that's not going to happen with the current regime of testing that we're going through in schools. The second area of development is the mobile area, where students can learn and be assessed anywhere, anytime, any place. Of course, there are issues of authenticity there are issues of identity and so on, as Andy alluded to earlier on. But ultimately, I think that's another trend that has to happen. And I know BTL is doing this. You've seen the map. And the third and final area, which I think is really vitally important, it's the central area, is personalization. Standardized testing just doesn't cut it when it comes to personalized learning. And I'll show you hopefully some methods later on which will address the personalized agenda. But here's another thought for you. How can you teach Shakespeare to students accustomed to tiny screens with brief flashes of communication that instantly fade away? How can we do this? How can we use the current testing to inspire students and not just test them? How can we assess them in authentic and realistic ways? That's the big question that lots of educators are trying to ask and answer the question with. Guy Claxton comes on board. I'll let you read that. This is a searing critique of the current system of assessment that we see in schools and in colleges, and to a certain extent in universities. I'll tell you something. There are two pockets of innovation happening right now from my own experience, going around the world and going to all these places. I work in learning and development as well as on all three sectors of education. And to me, the innovation is not just happening in the learning and development, where people have money from their businesses to actually be able to push corporate training to the nth degree, but also you'll see innovation happening in pockets in primary schools as well. You will not see it in secondary schools to a great extent because they are under the thumb when it comes to high-stakes testing. They are pushed and pushed and pushed to assess and to assess and to assess. And the teachers there just haven't got the time to innovate. In primary, they have a little bit more because they have one group of students who they get to know for a whole year. The students aren't coming in and going out the doors every 5 minutes. In further and higher education, you're going to see less innovation than you think, partly because of funding problems, but also because lecturers are now hard-pressed there as well. And I know that because I've just come out from that after 20 years as a lecturer in higher education. And I know that you just haven't got the time to research and innovate to the extent that your bosses want you to. So I see the innovation coming from primary schools and from business. So look out for those trends. This is John Davitt, who's an old friend of mine, and he's an education expert, and he actually sold something on eBay. And that's why he quotes back, which I think is marvelous. But it's also quite sad, because often students aren't getting the feedback that they need from their learning. You know, you go and you sit a test, and you get back the number 55 out of 100. What does that mean? It's a number. What does it mean? It means, well, you know, I'm kind of in the middle somewhere. You know, I've just passed because 40 is the pass mark, but I could have done a lot better. But it doesn't show you where you could do better. So I think we've got to start wondering about why we use numbers to grade students. Here's students taking notes. These students know that the technology they have in their pocket can be used to help them to learn in different ways. How about we start thinking about how we can use that thing in their pocket to actually help assess them as well, while they're on the move, while they're moving from place to place. What can that tool do to actually give us an insight into how well they're doing as a student? These are big questions, and nobody's got the answer to it yet, but everyone's working on it. So learners now not only consume content, but they create content and they mix it. And they share it. And here's a clue to how we can start to assess them using the tools in their pockets. How can we assess what they now create and what they now share and what they remix? What are they learning when they're doing that? So the social, personal, and connected aspects that I mentioned earlier on are going to be vitally important. And let me just move on a little bit and talk to you about this guy here. Who's heard of Sugata Mitra? Some of you? I've had dinner with Sugata several times now. We count each other as friends, and we're often talking. And one of the interesting things he said the other day to me was that through his own research with the Hole in the Wall projects and lately with the Granny Cloud and all this other stuff he's doing, is that there's an important concept that's emerging. We test children and we test young people on what they can essentially look up for themselves on the web. Any question that is in a question bank, they can Google it. What happens when they bring in the tools into the exam room and they Google everything there and then? It's not authentic anymore. So he says, why don't we go for what he calls the ungoogleable questions? This isn't working very well, but I'll Google it. There we go. The ungoogleable questions. You know, so what are the ungoogleable questions? So he says, instead of asking children what is 5 plus 5, why don't we ask them to go and find out why they've got 5 fingers on their hands? There's a lot more involved in that, isn't there? So he's trying to get students to think more deeply, more critically. These are the skills that they'll need when they enter the world of work. Of course, they'll need to know what 5 and 5 is, but a lot of what we do these days, and you can admit to this just like I can, you admit to actually going onto Google and finding stuff, or you know, you're watching a movie and you think, who was that actor? Who was he in that other movie with? And you Google it, don't you, there and then, to try and instantly find out what it was to answer your question. And there's so much we can do with what's in our hands now. We are dependent on that technology. We still need the skills, but I think we need to take it farther than the mind tools now. We need to go beyond that to the critical thinking aspects, which will make us, I suppose, more agile in a world of work in the future. And I could go through all these Charlie Brown cartoons here, where Lucy is actually asking, why did she get a C? You know, it's back to the numbers thing again, the numbers game. Why did she get a C for her coat hanger sculpture? Was it because it was about her piece of work itself? How can you judge that? What about if it was about her talent? She's got no control over that. Why is she being judged on that? What about if it was about her effort? Well, surely she put the best effort in that was possible. What about if it was about, you know, a judgment about her teacher? Surely the teacher should share her C with her, and so on. I mean, these are really valid questions, aren't they? And finally, squeaky wheel gets the grease, so obviously the teacher gave her a higher grade. But you see, what does that mean? What does it mean when you get a C? What does it mean when you get a 55 out of 100? How far can we go with critiquing that? So is assessment of learning or assessment for learning? I think it's both. I think we need a certain metric about where students are, but I think that we need to go beyond that. And Black and William talk about this, the idea of assessing for learning, giving students feed forward in more detail. So let me just talk about the way that we get to that, the kind of the trends, this kind of personalization trend. Back in the day, it was all about apprenticeships. Remember those? Back in the day when everybody had one career for life. And now the latest careers are portfolio careers when everyone has 5 or 6 careers. I've had 4 careers already in my life. I'm sure some of you have had more than one as well. So you start off with the apprenticeship model, which back in the day was about sitting at the feet of a master and learning about how to be similar to them in years to come. And then in came the standardized curriculum, the industrial age standardized curriculum, the just-in-case model, where everything was taught just in case you needed it. So you did loads of subjects at school, and then you were assessed on each one, and you could do selected GCSEs or O-levels or whatever it was in them days in each one that you selected to do. And then come out at the end qualified. It was a just-in-case model, fit for the industrial age. Later on, businesses started to realize that actually bespoke curriculum were better, and you could have a just-in-time model. And now we're coming back to just for me or even just enough learning. Personalized learning, we now call it, which leads us to things like personalized learning environments. And I'll just show you one of those. One of those is, that's me in the middle, by the way. We're all different. We're not all the same, and everyone faces in different directions. We all have different interests. So why are we all being assessed in the same way? Why are we all being standardized? Why are we having this happening? Which leads to this. We don't want people to be all the same. We want people to be different and to follow their own interests. So how can we assess them in different ways? Well, personalized learning environments have 3 elements. Some of the research we've been doing on this is that we have personal web tools. So there'll be web tools that you will use and students will use, which they will use on a regular basis. They will habituate into them. And these could be, a variety of tools. It could be something like Twitter or Google or whatever. But then on top of that, you've got what we call the personal learning network. And now each of us has a personal learning network. Each of us has people that we connect to actually help us to learn. People in the room, these could be your personal learning network. You don't need technology to make that happen. But you do once you disperse in 2 days' time. If you want to connect with each other, then you use another method like LinkedIn or email or whatever. But you'll maintain that personal learning network because it's important to you. And on top of that, you have what we would call the personal learning environment, which is everything else that sits alongside those things and makes it all function. So it could be that you go down to the newspaper stand every day and get a newspaper and read the news from that. I don't know why people do that today, because obviously it's already a day out of date, and you probably got it last night on Google or on BBC News Network anyway. So, but these are kind of what we call the tools that will help us to create a wider understanding of the world around us. So that's your personal learning network, and everybody in the room has one. You have one of these. You use it. You develop it all the time. It starts probably with the tool in your pocket and then goes to the tool on your desk at home or in your office. A lot of this is based around the technology that we use. And here are the 4 functionalities. You generate content, you share, you organize content, and you communicate with it. And those four ideas, I think, are really important. And it just takes us time to sit down and think about how can you assess in new ways using those tools. Here are some of the tools that are being used in each of these areas. So people blog. Does anyone here blog at all? No? Maybe, yeah. You used to, yeah? Yeah, some people use blogging. It's interesting because I started blogging about 10 years ago now, and I started off very tentatively. And then after a while, I got some ideas, and I started writing in a more circumscribed way, and then I started to research and use that and started putting out regular blog posts. And before I realized it, I had an audience out there. And that audience was interesting because they started to respond to my posts. So every time I pressed the publish button, I knew that within an hour or two, there'd be people commenting on it, and I would have to respond to them. And that made me think quite hard about what I was publishing. It made me think about the provenance of what I was publishing. It made me think about, is my grammar good enough? Are my sentence constructions effective enough? Have I put hyperlinks in that are accurate? Have I acknowledged all my copyright sources? Whole range of things that I had to think about. And suddenly I was thinking in a lot more detail and I was thinking more clearly. And Daniel Chandler, who's a friend of mine from Aberystwyth University, he said something really profound the other day. He said, in the act of writing, you are written. In the act of writing, you are written. Which means to me that your thoughts are quite chaotic and abstract until you put them down somewhere, whether it's on paper or on the screen. And then as you put them down, you suddenly start to understand better what you're thinking and what you're feeling and what your ideas are. And then you can mold them into something, edit them, polish them up, and present them as a piece of work which is a performance of your learning. And this is one of the things I've been doing with my students regularly at Plymouth recently. It's getting them to regularly blog so that they can think more clearly and more critically about what they're writing about. I will choose topics for them or allow them to choose them for themselves. And the amazing thing that's happened is that over a process of time, as those students have blogged regularly to an audience that they don't know that's out there, they've, I suppose, enabled their writing to improve to the extent that for the past 3 years running, I've had over 50% of my students achieve first-class honours degrees. Speaks for itself. It comes out in their essay writing. And a lot of my colleagues scratch their heads and say, Steve, how are you doing that? It's quite simple. You get them to think and write and put the two in tandem. And then you assess it in a traditional way, but you're assessing it through non-traditional methods. I guess I'm coming to the end of this now, so I'm going to go through some of these. We learn by doing, we learn by making, and there we go. What we need to worry about is things like assessment. So have you seen this one before? Find X. So the student says, here it is. And you have to ask, why did they get a 0 for that? Was it, back to Lucy and Peanuts, was it the teacher's fault for not being explicit? Or was it the student's fault for being a smart ass? Well, I'd like to think, actually, it was the teacher's fault. And the teacher should have given him something for that, or her. Here's another one. Expand this equation. Do you see what's happening here? This is a failure in pedagogy. This isn't a failure on the student's part. Although some of them, very funny, Peter, X, 0. This one here is a really good one. A college class was told they had to write a short story in as few words as possible. The instructions were the short story had to contain the following 3 things. 1, religion, 2, sexuality, and 3, mystery. And here's the only A+ answer. Wait for it. So you can have a bit of fun about assessment, can't you? But the interesting thing is, are we actually assessing what we think we're assessing here? When we put together these test items and we put together these essay questions and so on, are we actually assessing what we think we're assessing? Here's another one. I mean, these go on and on. I love that one. I mean, that's a perfect answer, I think. It's creative. But let me just ask you this question here. What is this? We'll finish with this and a few other ideas. What is that? Does anyone know? It's the Mandelbrot set. And what's the Mandelbrot set? Go on, Bob. Anyone know? It's fractals. It's a recursive mathematical equation. It recurses to almost infinity. So what I'm going to suggest to you is that a lot of what we're doing in education today is recursive. It's repeating what already is known. So therefore, what I do as a teacher, I want you to do as well. What I speak and what I know as a teacher, I want to transfer from my head into yours. And then you go out the door and you are, you're knowledgeable, you've qualified. But you see, that just repeats and repeats what we've already done. It repeats it and repeats it and repeats it in infinity. Nothing new is learned. So what we need to do is to go to a more discursive type of assessment, I think, where we're starting to assess things that the students aren't told in the room, but they go off and find for themselves and come back and show the teacher. I used to challenge my students and say to them, okay, go out of the room now and come back in 3 days' time and teach me something I don't know about this subject. And they go, what? You're the professor. I said, go and teach me something I don't know. Go and find out about it. And invariably, they'd come back and find me something I didn't know. And then we'd have a big debate about it, and I would act as their awkward student. A wonderful form of assessment because it makes them think critically, makes them think on their feet, makes them run around like blue-tailed flies trying to find the things that they think that I don't know. So, here's another example about how recursive education fails. Here's the equation. So the student was given this, various lessons on this equation, and then the teacher said, I tried to check if she really understood the example. So she gave her another one to work out, and this is what the student came up with. Can you see the problem? It's very superficial knowledge. It's recursive knowledge. It doesn't go any farther, and sometimes it goes wrong because it's superficial. It doesn't go into the deeper aspects of understanding. Now, this is a model which I often show because it shows a really good model of learning. I'm sure you know this one. Merton and Salyer. I worked with Roger Salyer recently in Singapore, and he was telling me about this. This was actually his PhD thesis from 1970-something, 1972. And he said, actually, people misquote this because there's actually 3 elements there. These are the first 2 elements, and you can easily examine surface learning by giving the students a batch of tests and asking them to respond. Is this A, B, C, or D? Multiple choice questions or whatever, multiple response. And the deeper learning has to be assessed through other things, like writing an exam, which has elements of discussion in it, where you have to argue for a point, or a project, or some continuous assessment, which goes on and with really deep understanding of the topic you're examining. But there's a third element. The third element is strategic learning, where you rapidly switch between those two to provide a more clear understanding of the world around you. How do we assess something like that? That's the sticky one. That's the really difficult one to try and assess. And that is another conundrum I'd like to leave you with. Blogging I've mentioned already. Just a few things to look out for. Open badges. Has anyone heard about open badges? Some of you? Open badges, I think, are quite interesting because what they are, in fact, is a 21st century exhibition of some kind of accreditation. They are given by awarding bodies or universities or conferences on the basis that somebody has achieved something. And if you click on the badge, hard baked into it is the metadata, which tells you where it was earned, how it was earned, what level it was, and so on. So that's one interesting one. Another one interesting one is the idea of massive open online courses, which leads to companies like Udacity. Have you heard of those? Offering what we call micro-accreditation, so nano degrees. And I think this is an interesting trend for the future as well, and this comes from not from the universities, but from employers who are saying, look, we don't care so much now whether someone's got a degree in philosophy, a first-class honours degree in philosophy from Oxford. What we care about is, can they code at this level? Can they create that kind of product? Can they be this kind of customer service person? And they want to know about the skills and the competencies. So this becomes, I suppose, an accreditation route for vocational and skills-based aspects, more than it does for some of the deeper kind of academic stuff that's happening. So I think that's an interesting trend. And one other thing, you mentioned games earlier on, Andy. I'll just touch on this briefly. Let me just talk to you about this aspect before we close. And children play games a lot. Young people play games. Does anyone else in the room here play games? Go on, admit it, some of you. And there's a lot of gamers around, you'd be surprised. In fact, there are more women playing games than men now. That's the latest trend. And a lot of these games are social games that are played online, in guilds and in groups and in teams and so on. And the interesting thing is, when you are playing these games, you are constantly assessing your own previous exploits against what you're doing today. So you already reached level 5, I want to reach level 6 now. And this is what we call ipsative assessment. Anyone heard of it? It comes from the special educational needs domain, where children were assessed against their own previous attainment, not against some kind of criterion-based or standard-based test. And ipsative assessment, I think, is going to become increasingly important, especially in an informal way, as we go into the 21st century and as people become more familiar with playing games. So I'll leave that thought with you as well. I won't talk about Jill Watson, who was a teaching assistant on a MOOC, and several students actually voted her as the best teaching assistant out of a bunch of about 12 that were on the group, and then they found out that she was actually a chatbot, which I think is quite interesting. Look her up. It's very interesting. One final thought for you before I close, and I'll just leave you with this thought and dump it on you from John Dewey. And I've skirted around lots of the issues because I knew I was going to run out of time, but I'm prepared to talk about any of this outside afterwards with any of you. And I'm prepared to argue with you if you want me to. I like a good punch-up. But I hope that's been kind of at least thought-provoking, although it's just been a touch on the surface of what we can do and what we can expect with technology in the coming years. But here are my contact details as well if you ever want to contact me. So with that, I say thank you very much.